Good morning, everyone. My name is Aisling McPartland, and I am part of the marketing team here at InfoTrack. Today's webinar will look at selecting the best commercial reports for your firm with Groundsure. I'm joined today by Andrew Crawshaw from Groundsure. In this session, we will look at potential risks to your client and which are most suitable reports for various transactions. Before we begin this webinar, which should take no longer than 40 minutes, I'd like to draw your attention to the box on the webinar software that allows you to ask questions as we go through. Type your questions here and we'll answer them at the end of the session. So I am now going to hand you over to Andy to present.
Lovely, thanks Aisling. And yeah, as Aisling said, in this session we're going to have a look at some of the risks associated with buying commercial property. I'll go through how we produce reports, and I'll also give you an idea of what to do just in case any risks are actually flagged in the reports as well. I will take you through our available commercial reports just to give you an idea as well of which ones are best suited to which certain transactions. So to give you an idea of how we got where we got to, we scanned and digitized around about 1.5 million historical maps around about 15, 16 years ago. On the left, you can see the paper copy maps, and then on the right-hand side is what it looks like when that digitization has taken place, and exactly how it looks on our system when any orders are put in, and we can identify exactly what's there, what's been there previously, when it was there, what the risk is associated with it. So hopefully we can make everything as accurate as possible and also get the reports back to you very quickly as well to help speed up processes your end. We have the highest quality historical maps on the market. It sets a new industry standard. All of our mapping was scanned in at over 500 dots per inch, whereas other providers, as you can see on the right-hand side, only scanned it in at 300 dots per inch. It just means that the clarity and resolution of our mapping is much higher, meaning the digitization of that historical land use database is a lot more accurate as well. And it's very important for our commercial environmental consultants when they are interrogating the mapping that they know exactly what's there and they can give a much clearer definition of what the risk is and also give you a much better guidance and opinion for your client to make a much more informed decision as well. So just to give you a bit of background on why we look for contaminated land stats as well. The Environment Agency estimate that there's around 300,000 hectares of land in England and Wales that is affected to some extent by industrial contamination. However, we've done some research here at Groundsure using our unique historic mapping data, and it's revealed that there's around 619,000 hectares that was formerly covered by a wide range of industrial uses, which is more than double the Environment Agency's figures. This equates to around 4% of land in England and Wales. And if you think that just 0.007% or just over 1,000 hectares of England and Wales landmass is officially designated as contaminated land, as set out by Part 2A of the Environmental Protection Act of 1990, our research suggests that there is a significant potential for more contaminated land sites to be identified based on the variance in brownfield land estimation. Now, when assessing environmental risk for commercial properties, it's really important that we have as much information as possible up front when the consultants are writing their reports. The commercial land use questions are required to be completed as accurately as possible to ensure that we can provide the best, most site-specific assessment and recommendations possible to your client. And these are a set of questions that you'll notice that we ask every time that you order a commercial report. If the questions are not answered correctly or accurately, this can lead to delays in the transaction and could potentially cause further costs down the road that could be avoided. So in terms of what we ask, we'll ask what the current land use, and we'll be able to get a very good idea of what the current land use is just by using Google Street View and historic Google mapping. But as transactions happen all the time in commercial properties, just to get a very good idea of an up-to-date what the current land use is really important for our consultants to write their reports. and I'll take you through some of our reports have operational risks that are associated with them, so we can give that guidance there. What is the intended land use, and also if the site is going to be redeveloped. This is really important in terms of what the potential risk is with a site. If, for example, you have a gasworks and you're keeping it as a gasworks, the environmental risk and also passing on that risk to any sort of receptor is much lower than if you're going to redevelop to a school or a housing development where children are going to be playing in the garden. We can also give you advice on any planning legislation that needs to be made aware of, and also any next steps and further guidance on exactly what your client needs to do to remediate the land as well. So all of our reports have recommendations that are bespoke and tailored to the needs of the report. The recommendations are dependent on the overall risk assessment and what the intended use of the site is. If, as I said, the site is to be redeveloped, then additional factors are taken into consideration, and they are highly linked to the land uses identified on site or within the vicinity. We do, as I'll take you through, each of the steps on exactly what the risk is, and we bespoke and tailor this to each report. So if, for example, the risk assessment comes back that the current land use of the property could be an issue, this could be something like if it's a garage or petrol station or manufacturing facility. If it's been identified to be of a potential concern, then a phase 1 site assessment is usually recommended. This will include a site walkover, and we'll do a review of the association permits. We will also provide our bespoke expert team of consultants on actually looking at giving you the guidance and opinion based on that site walkover. Can they see if there is the contaminant linkage with a receptor, and is that still in place? Has there been anything that has actually been put in place to make sure that that's not going to be a risk for your clients? And it does cover any potential liability regarding the current and past use of the site. If the reason is historic land use, if there has been any identification of significant concern that has happened previously using our historical mapping, then we would ask you to get in touch with the local authority just so that they can answer any questions that we might have, and we'll put that in the report for you as well. So are the local authority aware of any previous use of the site? If they are aware, are they going to look into it? If they are going to look into it, what sort of priority are they giving it? Is it high, medium or low? If they are going to investigate it and they have put it on their priority list, what sort of time scale are they giving for that investigation to go ahead? And all of this can be used in us hopefully changing the outcome of the report so that it becomes a pass, and we will put caveats in the report to say that we've got that information from the local authority. If the site is going to be redeveloped, then if it's been recently developed, then further consultations with the local authority would be required. So we'd need clarity on what further measures will be required for the redevelopment. Are they looking at any site investigation or remediation measures that were specified in their planning consent? And we'd also need proof of discharge for the planning conditions relating to contaminated land. As I said previously, if we receive sufficient information, then hopefully we can amend the outcome of the report to an acceptable environmental risk. So one of the things that differs our commercial reports from residential is that we offer a 5-tiered risk approach. Now, why do we illustrate risk this way with commercial reports? We've designed our risk assessment using the main guidances within the UK around contaminated land risk assessment. We are looking at the probability based on our data that there may be a source or a contaminant, a pathway and a receptor linkage in terms of contaminated land. We then combine that with a likelihood of any identified risk causing significant harm. A tiered approach is advised to show, just in order to show a graduated indication of risk. So as I said, residential reports will very much be a pass or a need of further assessment, but we will put these stages in place just so that your client understands exactly what the risk is, and also any lenders will understand what any of the risks are. Also, when assessing the risk of contamination, we provide these 4 assessments on the front page of the report. We will ask if there is any statutory risk or any third-party action being taken against the site. And this will refer to whether historical land uses carried out on site are likely to mean that the site would be investigated under Part 2A of the Environmental Protection Act. And subsequently, is there a risk that the site owner may be liable for any remediation required under this legislation? We'll also ask if the property represents acceptable banking security from an environmental risk perspective. And this would just look at whether a bank could securely lend money on the property from an environmental risk perspective. The bank would be concerned with A, ensuring that the loan made would be repaid and that nothing from an environmental liability standpoint would prevent the lender from being able to repay the loan. And B, ensuring that if it came to the eventuality that the bank would have to repossess the property and thus become the site owner, they would not be caught as the Class B person responsible for remediation that may be necessary on site. We'll also ask if the property value may be impacted due to environmental liability issues, and this will look at if there's a chance that the property may be affected by issues relating to contaminated land. If you are purchasing a property that may have a legacy of contamination, your client would need to consider this when the site is being valued. And obviously these questions are really important for your client to understand if they are going to have to pay any money for remediation, if the lending on it is going to be accepted, but also, as I said, if the bank does need to repossess a site for whatever reason, are they going to be liable for any cleanup costs? So it's something that is good for your client to know, but also good for the lender to have that security, understanding that they're not at risk of taking anything on that they might not want to. And in all of our reports, we also look at flood risk. And just to give you an idea of what's happening in the UK at the moment, there are currently 5.9 million properties at flood risk. This is using the most up-to-date Environment Agency stats and data. This has risen by 700,000 properties just over the last 4 years. And just to give you an idea that 55% of water treatment plants and 14% of electricity infrastructure is also at risk. So it's not just the risk of properties being hit by the floodwaters, but also a wider area being at risk of having clean water and also electricity as well. And this slide is just intended to give you an idea of how much a large-scale flood cost event costs in the UK. And if we go back to the last large-scale flooding event, which was of Christmas 2015, this was the biggest flood event to hit the UK. It was also the most extreme event on record. It was estimated that the total combined costs of these 2015 winter floods were between £5 and £5.8 billion. And this is based on insured losses, underinsurance, local authority and infrastructure costs, business loss funding gap, flood defences, and change to the insurance industry business model. So in terms of insured losses, that was between £1 and £1.5 billion. And that's just the estimated cost of claims made by insured homeowners and businesses. Underinsurance was around £1 billion. The limits on many insurance policies meant that they were inadequate for covering the full loss. Local authorities and infrastructure costs of £0.5 to £0.7 billion. Some of the costs to local authorities for the expense of returning communities to normal would be covered by the insurance. But the scale of the flooding and the level of the infrastructure damage, including knock-on effects and claims to public transport, utility companies and social services, suggested that the government would be required to provide additional funding. This excludes any further investment into reinforcing flood defences. There was also a business loss funding gap of 50 to 100 million pounds, and this included grey areas of business coverage, such as loss of attraction and market value, which are not typically covered by insurers and therefore represent significant costs that businesses had to absorb. There was cost to repairing and replacing flood defences, which came to about £2 billion, and also a change to the insurance industry business model of about 0.5 billion. And KPMG predicted that insurers and their supply chains would be required to rethink their business models and products. In England and Wales, there's over 300,000 business premises that are at risk from flooding. And flooding is the most likely peril to cause damage and disruption to the UK business property. Flooding accounts for 33% of all losses to business property. So within our reports, we will provide an overall flood risk rating, which is based again on a 5-tiered scale. So we'll look at low, low to moderate, moderate, moderate to high, and high. And we'll also provide a negligible risk if there is a very minimal flood risk in the area. The overall flood rating is calculated combined risk taking into account flooding from rivers, the sea, surface water, groundwater, historical flood events, and the presence of flood defences. And each flood risk type has a different weighting. And then one of the problems that we'll see in the UK is that each year around 10,000 homes are built in the floodplain, and this equates to 1 in 14 homes. In the 5 years since 2012-2013, 1,228 residential properties were built after being given the green light, even after the Environment Agency advice was overruled. The Environment Agency figures show that it has raised objections on flood risk grounds in more than 14,000 planning applications since 2012-13. Of those where the decision is known, the agency's objections have been overruled or partially overruled on 330 occasions. One single application included nearly 1,000 residential units, while another had more than 500 units on there. Many of the properties were in flood zone 3, which is the highest level of flood risk, including several where there was a concern over risk to life or property, or the development was next to a watercourse or flood defences. Where building in these areas is being considered, councils must ensure that suitable alternative sites at lower flood risk are not available, that new developments will be resistant to flooding and safe for its lifetime, and flood risk will not be increased elsewhere. At the end of the day, the Environment Agency is only a consultee who provides advice. The final decision rests with the local planning authorities. And this is a housing development up in the northeast that was flooded near Newcastle on the Glassdeer estate in Ruffin. This was a Taylor Wimpey development of around 120 units. And what happened here was that it was inundated with water after a major flood event. They did a site walkover before. They noticed that flood defences were in place, a flood defence runoff, but they didn't actually report that there were bars and grids actually stopping this runoff from happening. And this was getting clogged up with the usual of any sort of vegetation, shopping trolleys, the usual stuff you'll see in a river or an embankment, which stopped the flood defences being workable. So the flood defences got clogged up, the water kept on coming down, and obviously caused this flooding. Only around 50 of the properties had been sold on the Glassdeer estate, and they were unable to sell any more. People needed to be rehoused, and also the loss of confidence in the estate meant that they couldn't sell any more properties on there. And then this is from those 2015 floods up in Leeds. So this is ThyssenKrupp. This is a site that employed more than 100 people, and it was forced to close permanently as a result of those winter floods. It had been part of the landscape in the area for over 100 years, And the site, as you can see from the map, was at risk from both river flooding of a high risk and also of surface water flooding, which was a significant risk. That deluge of flooding in Leeds alone battered over 3,000 properties, 672 of which were businesses. And climate change is a very real thing, and it's something that we're noticing is ever changing, and the risk of flooding is becoming more. I don't want to sound all doom and gloom, but Met Office records show that since 1910, there have been 17 record-breaking rainfall months or seasons, with 9 of them actually coming since the year 2000. As intense storms are becoming more frequent, sea levels are also rising because of climate change. And Sir James Bevan, the chief executive of the Environment Agency, said, "Climate change is likely to mean more frequent and intense flooding. Flooding destroys lives, livelihoods and properties. Our flood defences reduce the risk of flooding, and our flood warnings help keep communities safe when it threatens, but we can never entirely eliminate the risk of flooding. Checking your flood risk is the first step to protecting yourself, your loved ones and your home." We've seen many storms over the years. Back in 2012, we saw almost 8,000 homes and businesses that were flooding across the southwest. In the winter of 2013-14, saw the wettest winter for 250 years, with 11,000 homes flooded up in the north and northeast and eastern coasts. And then we have those floods from 2015-16 as well. It's also becoming a increasing risk as well, which is demonstrated by it being listed as one of the nation's major threats. Last year, the Met Office published new innovative research which found that in England and Wales, there is a 1 in 3 chance of a new monthly rainfall record in at least one region each winter. One of the things that the government are trying to do is put more things in place that can reduce the flood risk at new build developments. So back in 2015, the government's new planning policy on eco-friendly sustainable drainage systems at major new housing developments came into effect. The overriding aim of the policy is to lessen the likelihood and impact of surface water flooding from new developments by encouraging the use of sustainable drainage systems, or SUDs. As a consequence, lead local flood authorities have also made statutory consultees and new non-statutory guidance which has been published under the changes. So this decision by the government on the increased use of SUDs has been long awaited and surrounded in controversy. Initially, it was proposed through the Flood and Water Management Act of 2010 that SUDs should be approved before development commences by a body set up by local authorities to ensure that SUDs are designed according to national standards. There was concern amongst developers that the system could cause delays to developments as a result of second approval being required in addition to planning permission. There was also concern that the approval bodies might not be fully prepared to cope with their new duties in a timely manner. Further, the Flood and Water Management Act of 2010 requires local planning authorities to adopt and maintain approved SUDs which are functioning properly and serve more than one property. To protect the public whilst avoiding excessive burdens on business, this policy does now apply to all developments of 10 homes or more and to major commercial development as well. The government will keep this under review and consider the need to make any adjustments where necessary. The current requirements in national policy that all new developments in areas at risk of flooding should give priority to the use of sustainable drainage systems, and this will continue to apply. So if anything does flag up as a flood risk, again, we will give bespoke recommendations tailored to each type of flood risk that's been identified, but we'll also give general advice as well to consider flood prevention measures, actually look at the insurance that's on offer, and we'll also give guidance on checking if a full flood risk assessment is required under the new planning policy framework. Also in our reports, we will cover our ground stability information in full. And subsidence is a lowering or collapse of the ground. It can be triggered by man-made disturbance, a change in draining patterns, heavy rain, by water abstractions, and subsidence has the potential to cause engineering problems such as damage to foundations, buildings, and infrastructure. And it can have many causes, from man-made issues such as those based on the underlying geology in area. Natural ground subsidence refers to the upward, lateral or downward movement of the ground that can be caused by a range of natural geological hazards. Such movements are typically in the order of centimetres, but in exceptional circumstances can be much larger. The Association of British Insurers estimates that subsidence or ground movement is the cause of between 30 to 40,000 insurance claims per year, with an average cost to the insurance industry of around 300 million. However, this can rise to about £1 billion in an extreme year, where it has either been extremely dry or extremely wet. Significant natural ground instability has the potential to cause subsidence damage to some weaker buildings and structures, and individual claims can run to the tens of thousands of pounds if a property has to, say, be underpinned or rebuilt. Subsidence is covered on all good buildings insurance policies with the standard excess. And if we look at insurance claims for subsidence damage last year, it hit levels that we haven't seen since 2006, which we saw a massive heat wave. And the summer of last year of 2018 saw that come back again, where the ABI said compensation for things like cracked doors, walls and windows almost quadrupled in July, August and September compared to the same period of 2017. It reported claims worth more than £64 million, submitted by more than 10,000 households during that third quarter of 2018, which was the most since that heat wave of 2006. Subsidence is a regular feature of hot weather, as soils will shrink back because of the lack of moisture, and ground containing heavy concentrations of clay is often the worst affected, as shifts put stress on windows, pipeworks and even foundations. Signs of stress can include doors and windows failing to open and the sudden appearance of often diagonal cracks in buildings. And the biggest risk that we have in the UK is that a lot of the UK is built on clay. So the image on the left will show a subsidence hazard in a normal year versus a subsidence hazard in an extremely hot and dry year, such as last year. So shrink swell of clay soils is a result of the changes in moisture of clay-rich soils. This is reflected in a change in volume of the ground through shrinking and swelling. Swelling pressures can cause heaving or lifting of structures, whilst shrinkage can cause differential settlement. This shrink-swell behaviour is the most damaging geohazard in Britain today, costing the economy an estimated £3 billion over the last 10 years. Subsidence claims are usually closely linked with the clay belt that sits across the southeast of England. Clay is found elsewhere in the UK too, and last year's extended dry spell affected large areas of the southwest, the Midlands, the northwest and the northeast, which are producing notable spikes in subsidence claims for the first time in a generation. So clay itself is not the problem. If the clay beneath a house shrinks, the whole property might settle, but it usually does so evenly across its footprint unless other factors are present. These can often include vegetation on one side or corner of a house, modern extensions built to inadequate standards, or water leaking into foundations from collapsed drains. Trees are biological water pumps, and their extensive roots remain the #1 cause of subsidence. Poplars, willows and oaks are among the worst culprits, as they have long root structures that can stretch for over 30 metres and may soak up more than 50,000 litres out of the ground each year. This accelerates the shrinkage of clay subsoil, and depending on the position in relation to a property, can make the rate of shrinkage uneven. This causes properties to distort in different directions, leading to gradually expanding cracks in walls. People often look for large, easily exposed roots to determine whether a tree is causing subsidence, but it is the thin, fibrous roots at the extremes of a root system that have the biggest demand for water. And displayed on your screen now are some of the man-made sources of subsidence, which we will also look for in our reports. We have some 5,000 years of historic mining in the UK, so coal mining is another large source of subsidence claims, but these are generally dealt with outside of the insurance industry by the Coal Authority. And the Coal Authority have apparently dealt with over 500,000 claims in the last 30 years. To give a little background, mining generally started out as shallow scrapes. And in the case of coal mining, early coal mining tended to occur in the form of bell pits, which, as the name suggests, were bell-shaped and tended to be shallow and known to collapse. As time went on, mining increasingly turned deep underground and probably peaked around the 18th, 19th century. But this has left us with a legacy of old mines, many of which we simply don't know exactly where they are. The Coal Authority, for instance, has a huge warehouse of old paper mining maps, which they inspect and try to make sense of. The early maps are in some cases very inaccurate, and this is why here at Groundsure we use maps going back as 1842, as this is when Ordnance Survey started and mapping started to become sufficiently credible. So unfortunately, we don't know where all the old mines or mining features are, and the Coal Authority still discover and work really hard to locate the various shafts and eddics. Another issue that might come up is HS2, and I know it's been in the news quite a lot recently, and we should have some more news on it by the end of the year, or we've been promised to. But also, government advisors have been warned that many locations along the HS2 rail line have unstable soil, putting high-speed trains at risk of derailment. So this unstable soil basically means that if you run a train over it at 250 miles an hour, then there is a chance that it will come off the tracks. So there are three areas that the British Geological Survey have highlighted: Perivale in West London, Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire, and Hampton in Ardham, just south of Birmingham, as being at particular risk. So what they'll need to do is either spend billions of pounds shoring up the ground around these areas, or run the trains much slower over these patches of HS2, which makes a high-speed train not very worthwhile. So that is phase one, and also in phase two, there is this area of a salt mining district, which will mine for the Cheshire Brine. And these are around the towns of Middlewich, Northwich and Winsford. So there is still commercial mines there, and over several centuries, these enormous caverns have been dug out just beneath the surface to extract salt, leading to frequent ground collapses. Many buildings have already had to be shored up against subsidence, and as I said, commercial mining continues today. So again, with HS2, they will need to slow the trains over several stretches. This will cut or even eliminate its advantage over conventional rail. Alternatively, they may need to do some massive works to stiffen up the ground that the line runs over, potentially adding billions of pounds again. So depending on the type of ground stability risk that has been identified, depends on the recommendations that we include. Some general recommendations for all types of ground stability can be seen on the right-hand side of your screen, but we would consider having a structural survey conducted by a structural surveyor just to determine whether or not the property is affected. Note that any sort of structural survey would obviously supersede the Groundsure report. We'd recommend doing a visual check at the property, looking out for any cracks and any other signs of subsidence. However, be aware that recent redecoration of the property may mask any signs. Consider contacting the relevant local authority just to ask for records of the property and local area relating to subsidence. And also remember that professional advice should be sought before altering the ground in any way at the property, which includes planting any trees. So in terms of our commercial products, we have three that we offer. We have our screening report, our review report, and our agricultural report. And we've tailored these reports for anything that you might need to do in terms of what sort of transaction you're dealing with and how much detail your client is looking at getting in the report. And if they need to appease any lenders, exactly how much detail they need in the report to do that and get the lending through in a timely manner. So with our reports, and this goes across the board with all of them, they're all intelligently filtered. So they will only display the results that are relevant to the property, which means that there are no blank maps or data pages where where data is not present for that particular risk. So if, for example, flood risk isn't a risk, doesn't come up for the area that you're looking at, we won't put any maps or information on there purely because we've checked it. We know there isn't a risk. We don't need to fill the report with the relevant information. We will always include information on contaminated land because we know that environmental lawyers like to have that information there, even if there is nothing at risk at the site. We have got a new layout to our reports, which means that it improves the flow. There, it's all written in plain English with jargon-free explanations, which means that your client can understand exactly what's going on and hopefully don't come back asking as many questions. All of this means that there are 70% fewer pages, which if you print them out or send them on, should make life a lot easier. And there's also site boundary or master map. And we also use land registry polygon data to give an indication of exactly what the boundary of a property is. And just a few things that all of our commercial reports have in common. We always review our small scale mapping, and I'll take you through exactly what the difference is between small scale and large scale mapping. I mentioned those acceptable banking risk security questions that we ask. They've all got bespoke recommendations and next steps. All of our reports have full flood risk information in them, meaning that there's no need to get a separate flood report. And if you do get any further information from us, like information from a local authority, then we will reassess the reports free of charge. And all of our reports are not just written by one of our qualified consultants, we also get them peer reviewed by somebody else in the team to make sure that we're giving you the right information and that right guidance and opinion on each report. So we use Ordnance Survey 6-inch to the mile or 1 to 10,000 scale mapping and a more detailed 25-inch to the mile or a 1 to 2,500 scale mapping. This allows specific features of concern to be seen more clearly in urban areas, as well as greater detail for buildings and railways. The Ordnance Survey 6-inch maps record will actually show most man-made and natural features in the landscape and represented the first comprehensive survey of all England and Wales at a consistent scale and specification. It is said that every road, railway, fence, wall, stream and building is shown, and it will also show even smaller features such as letterboxes, bollards on quaysides, mileposts and flagstaffs. Within the mapping, uncultivated land is distinguished by different symbols for marsh, bog and rough grassland. Types of woodland are distinguished as well, such as birch or fir or brushwood. And it'll also show parks, ornamental grounds and orchards. All public boundaries and administrative boundaries, including civil parish and county boundaries, are clearly shown. And just to give you an idea of how the mapping differs in small scale and large scale. So if we look here towards the bottom, you will see that there's a sewage works just down the middle in the bottom. And just above the sewage works, you can see that there's these circular items that we're not quite sure how they are. To the top right of that, there's an allotments, and there's also these little rectangular items that we don't know what they are, and also these symbols for marshland and bogland as well. If we look at the high scale mapping, so that 1 to 2,500, you can see that the sewage works, and it's zoomed in, there's a lot more detail there. But instead of sewage works, we have filter beds. and where those rectangular shapes are, we have sludge lagoons. So this just means you get a lot more detail, and we can also write a more informed opinion on exactly what the risks is based on it being a filter bed or a sludge lagoon, as opposed to it being an overall risk on a sewage works, and that assumption of what's actually in the sewage works and what that risk and opinion and guidance will be on there. So again, depends what your client wants, how much detail they want to go into, but I'll take you through in a second exactly which of our reports cover which detail of mapping. And this slide just puts into perspective how big 15 hectares is. So all of our reports in the first instance, in the first tier, will go up to 15 hectares. And as you can see, it's just around the size of the O2 and the surrounding area. So the first report we have is the Groundsure screening report. This is a report that we'd recommend for transactions on the lower scale. So if it's of less value, if your client's dealing with a chip shop or a hairdresser's, for example, they need to get the information for a lender on contaminated land, then this is the report that we would offer. This is a report that looks at that lower scale mapping. It also goes through our risk algorithm before being passed to a consultant if any risks of concern flag up. It reviews contaminated land fully. It's got full flood information. It will do a radon check. It's got our Groundsure full ground stability information. And it also shows energy information as well, such as if there's any oil and gas sites, if there are any proposed wind farms or solar farms, if there's any major energy infrastructure going on in the area, and if there's any major gas pipelines or electricity lines there. It'll also show planning constraints. So, you know, if there's any major development that could be restricted in the area for your client, or if they're worried about anybody else doing it there as well. And as you can see, we have those banking security questions on the front page. And it's set out quite easily to read. And as I mentioned before about that having, if there isn't a risk involved, then we don't put the information on. You'll see that on that example on the right, ground stability is passed. It doesn't have a page number next to it because we've checked it. Everything's okay with ground stability. There's no need putting any further information in the site. We also have our review report, which is a report that we would recommend for higher end transactions, or if it's any sort of contentious transaction as well. If you know there's going to be a risk associated with it, such as your client is buying a petrol filling station, if they're looking to redevelop, this is a report that will look at that high detail mapping and also be completely written by one of our consultants. So they will sit down and write every report from front to back. They will interrogate every single historical map associated with a site. So if there's been one map a year since 1842, they will have a look at every map and also give a running commentary on the changes between each map. So there is a higher turnaround time on this, but it does have that bigger amount of detail. It will review contaminated land, flood, ground stability, radon and energy, just like the screening report. It also has full transportation information in there. So if you're in an area of underground railways, such as London, Newcastle, Merseyrail, Glasgow, this will give you the information on that. It will look at HS2, Crossrail 1 and 2. It will also look at national rail lines and stations on there as well. So when we were redeveloping this report, we asked a lot of commercial solicitors about planning applications and if they wanted them in there. 50% said that they do, and 50% said if we put planning applications in the report, they would never buy one of the reports. So we've made this report available with planning applications or without at no further cost. So it's entirely dependent on what your client wants and what you want to look at. And also this report is good for redevelopments as well. So when redeveloping a site, it is the responsibility of the developer just to ensure that the property is suitable for use. And as such, it is likely that as a minimum, a phase 1 risk assessment will be required as part of the planning process before the development starts. So this Groundsure review report, like any other database desktop study that does not include a site walkover, it doesn't cover off a developer's responsibility under planning in relation to contaminated land. However, it's a great starting point if considering redeveloping a property. It's a resource that can be used at the inception of the redevelopment process when drawing up plans and doing preliminary budgets. It also, with this report, looks at that operational environmental risk, which will give you an idea of why we asked that question, so we can let your client know that if everything stays the same, what the risk is of keeping it as it is. We also have our Groundsure agricultural report. This is a report that if your client is buying agricultural land to stay as agricultural land, then this is the one that they would want to get, purely because it has a load of data sets in it that you wouldn't necessarily need unless you were keeping it as agricultural land. So it will look at everything that the review report covers, but it will also give you an idea of any riparian ownership. So if there are waterways on the land, does your client need to maintain them? It looks at timber felling licenses. It gives an agricultural land classification, so what grade of soil there is there, so your client knows if they'll be able to grow crops. It looks at environmental and countryside stewardship schemes, any waste exemptions, and also any current and historical rights of way, so your client knows if anything's going to crop up in the future under the new proposed legislation that the government's bringing in, that by 2025, all of the public rights of way need to be identified as well. This report will always give a risk rating based on it being agricultural land. So again, it wouldn't be suitable if you're looking to redevelop the site or if it's going to be for any other use. And here at Groundsure, we have a team of expert in-house environmental specialists which produce our extensive report portfolio. A key question that we are asked is around the level of education and experience of this team. And with Groundsure, you can be assured of verified levels of education, broad experience and continuous professional development, all leading to a meticulous approach to producing the highest quality reports. Environmental risk professionals are typically members of a wide range of professional bodies. No single body claims to be the sole representative organisation for these professionals, and this reflects the interdisciplinary nature of the subject matter and the varying affiliations that our staff hold. The Groundsure team compiling our environmental reports all have degrees in a relevant environmental discipline as a minimum standard. And we are a full consultancy service. So if you ever need anything like client care letters to show how important environmental reports are to your clients, we can get those out to you. If you need any pre or post sale support, you can call the number on the bottom of every single one of our reports. And more importantly, your client can give us a call if they have any questions about our reports and actually speak to the environmental consultant who wrote the report, and they will happily go through that with them. If you need any product collateral, such as sample reports or product cards, we can offer this for you. And as I said, we're a full consultancy service, so if you ever do have any questions, then please feel free to get in touch. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your time today. I'll now pass you back to Aisling at InfoTrack.
Andy, thank you for your time today, and we hope those of you who joined us found it very informative. If anyone has any questions about the products that you've seen today, they are available on the InfoTrack platform, and if you would like more information, please contact your account manager. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to welcoming you to another webinar very soon.